Welcome to the Simple Doesn't Mean Easy podcast. We are here every Monday working at simplifying things in our lives one day at a time, one simple step at a time. I'm your host, Michelle Visser, and today we're doing something I love to do. We are talking about the history of something really cool in our nation. We're talking about the history of fresh flour and enriched flour, which is what most people currently use that you buy at the store, that white bleached, quote, air quotes, enriched flour. Today, Gary Leavitt is with us. He is the president of Le Chef, which is the parent company over Nutrimill and Bosch. Nutrimill makes some of the most amazing grain mills. And I actually own one, two, three. I own three Nutrimill grain mills. I've done a previous episode about why this crazy lady owns so many mills. So I will link that in the show notes if you'd like to know more about that. And is it that same episode or a different one? I'm forgetting now. I've also done an episode where I break down the details about each mill, what's my favorite parts about them, what things I don't love as much, how I choose my personal favorite, etc. So I'll link all that information in the show notes. Also, you can go to Solely Rested, SOULY rested.com/flour, FLOUR. There I link the grain mills I use. I share my special savings code. Gary does hint at it later in this episode. And I also, there's a couple more things there. I give you a place where you can sign up to get all of my free, and there's a lot of them, fresh flour resources. And I link there to an article I've written, a very in-depth, ultimate guide to choosing a grain mill, because I know for every single person, every single family, there is a different perfect grain mill for different reasons. So I break down all of the factors you want to think about and consider before you decide which grain mill is going to be the perfect one for you, because it might be different than the perfect one for me. So go to Solely Rested, SOULY rested.com/flour, FLOUR, and get all those details. Also, if you don't get the weekly email that gives you links to how you can listen to the podcast, watch the podcast, and all the links that are mentioned when I have a guest on or it's a solo episode and I'm referring to different studies, everything that we mention is sent in that email. So you don't have to go find the show notes and you don't have to go looking for the details. If you're not getting that, I would love to start sending it to your inbox. Just go to solelyrested.com/podcast and sign up there. solelyrested.com/podcast. So Gary Leavitt is going to come on and we're talking about, I find it so intriguing, just what it would have been like in the 1800s and the 1900s to go to a grain mill to get your flour ground up. And also we're going to talk, he even goes back as far as Adam and Eve. He talks a lot about ancient Egypt, stuff I didn't even know he was going to bring in. Fascinating, cool stuff if you are a history buff like I am, or if you're just interested in flour and the process that it's gone through over the millennium of the past. One thing we don't get into that I actually want to just mention, we don't really talk a lot about the process of growing the wheat. If you listen to the whole episode, it'll really stick with you how complicated a process it was for our grandparents to have flour. It was not an easy process. And in the 1920s and 30s, they could get true fresh ground flour from their local grain mill. But as Gary describes it, there's quite a few steps in what they had to do to get that fresh flour compared to today, where I literally flip a switch, toss some berries in the top of my grain mill, and instantly have my flour shooting out right there on my kitchen counter. It's just really neat to think about how different it was for our grandparents and what we take for granted today. But we don't even get into the growing part. I was talking with my uncle last month, and my mom was one of 10 kids. And my uncle still remembered a lot from his childhood. And I told him that I haven't even announced it on here yet. And I don't know when this is going to be published. Maybe maybe the course will almost be available. I told my uncle, I'm writing an ebook and creating a full masterclass digital course all about fresh flour, about grinding your own grains, about making your own flour, and then using it to bake so many amazing things in your kitchen. Any tips and tricks that you need, and all the obstacles that you need to understand so you can overcome them and have the best baked products and the best breads. I'm excited about this. I've been working on this for, oh goodness, well over a year. And I think maybe when this is released, it's either going to be close to available or maybe available. So I'm really excited. But I was talking to my uncle about this, just telling him how excited I was. And honestly, he doesn't have a clue what a digital course is or an ebook. So I didn't get into too many details about that. But I just told him I was writing about fresh flour. And he really took off on the topic, wanting to tell me about what it was like for he and my mom and the other 8 siblings when they needed flour. So here's the part that I'm getting to. You had to have, at least in West Virginia, in rural areas where my family grew up, my mom and uncle, you had to have someone come to your farm with the right threshing equipment once a year to be able to thresh your wheat berries. And it was a complete, all day long, very rigorous effort. This was, of course, even with the machine. So the guy would bring his machine, but even with a family of 10 kids, there were not enough hands on deck to get everything done unless families got together. So he was naming off a couple local families that would all the families and all their kids would come over to, and everybody would help. And then the next day, guess what? You don't get to sit back and rest. The next day, you're going to the neighbor's farm where the same thresher is going with his equipment and taking down their wheat. And this was quite a multiple day process, all day long, very strenuous effort. And the women are, in the kitchen making the meals to put out the big spread to feed everybody each day. It was quite an event. And that was just to harvest the grain. Then you would have to store the wheat berries and you'd have to do it carefully to keep the rats out and to keep them dry. And my uncle said once a month. I didn't question Gary anymore about that because Gary makes it pretty clear that you'd probably go to the grain mill, to the grist mill more than once a month. So I don't know if my uncle was just kind of rounding his numbers in his head and maybe he rounded up from 2 weeks to 4. I don't know. But he said he thought about once a month. He and my grandfather, his dad, would load up enough wheat berries for the month and they'd be in barrels, put them on the back of the wagon and head off to the grist mill where they would turn those wheat berries into flour. And so Gary gets into the rest of the story. All the rest, listen in and you'll hear the whole step-by-step way that this was done. But to think about that you have to plant the wheat, you have to tend to it the whole growing season. Then you have to have your threshing day, and not just for yourself, but all your neighbors, so you can all help each other. And then you're going to the grist mill at least once a month, but more likely every week or every other week, and getting your flour. So it's quite a process. And it makes me so thankful for the technology that we have today. It blows my mind that we can have fresh flour, whole wheat berries with 40 out of 44 essential nutrients in our flour at the flick of a switch. My grandmother would have never believed it. So, and by the way, Gary talks about his grandmother and her experience making bread and the first time she used a Bosch mixer and how she teared up. It's just a beautiful story. And that's, I think, near the end. So stick with us. You're really going to like this episode. Before we dive into this episode, I want to talk about meat for a second. Did you know that unless you personally know your rancher or your farmer who is raising the meat that you're eating, it most likely came here on a large barge from who knows where across the ocean. And it was repackaged in some way here in the US, so it could be labeled as a product of the US. And if you're paying for the really best cuts because they have some fancy label on them, most likely you are being greenwashed because these terms don't mean a darn thing. Even if you do find a local farmer, you might not know. In fact, they might not know. if their animal feed is being sprayed with glyphosate before it gets to their farm. Go to 99counties.com because there I have a great solution for you. It's a new platform that is connecting consumers like us who genuinely care about our food directly to regenerative farmers across the Midwest who are doing things right. Use code solely rested at 99counties.com and take $30 off your first order. Isn't that great? Or go to solelyrested.com/beef. I link to everything there and I share with you some tips and insights and delicious recipes for preparing pasture raised meat. Solelyrested.com/beef. BEEF. Gary, I am so excited to be sitting down and talking to you about this topic today because, first of all, I love history. Second of all, I am passionate about fresh flour and the nutrients that it gives us the ability to feed our family in something so simple as flour. So I'm really excited to pick your brain and hear all that you want to tell us about the history of flour today. So thank you for coming on.
You're welcome. Happy to be here. Happy to join you, Michelle. Thanks.
Well, what can you tell us about? I mean, where do we even start, honestly? I don't even know what I want to say because
You
when I
start
think
with Adam
about
and Eve.
that's going back a little further than we have time for, maybe. I don't know. What did they do for flour?
Well, probably mortar and pestle type of
I
grind.
assume. I can't imagine
Maybe
how
some
long it would
crude
take.
stones, but when they
Can't
were
imagine
driven
how
out
long
of
it
the
would take.
garden, they were told that they were going to work by the sweat of their brow to eat their bread all the days of their lives, and they did.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But more specifically today, I'd love to know about the old grist mills. I mean, we live in a house that was built in probably around 1800 here in New England. And when we look at maps from 1840, there was a grain mill. That's the first map we have of this area. There was a grain mill right at the end of what is now our drive, right at the river, where there is now a dam. So I'm pretty sure we live in the miller's house, and I find the whole thing fascinating and I would love for you to just paint a picture for us of what was it like back in the 1800s to own a grain mill and what was it like to be the person taking your grains to the grain mill?
Well, I can give you a little bit of history that I'm familiar with. And then because this goes all the way back to ancient Egypt, ancient Rome,
Yep.
and that's really when they first started processing flour, get rid of the bran and the oils and just left with basically the endosperm, the white protein part of the wheat, which
Okay,
is what
even
we
back in
make.
ancient Egypt. I didn't know that.
The ancient Egyptians loved the royalty, and the upper class loved their white bread, and the same with ancient Rome. And
Wow.
but they didn't have white bread like we have, where they can literally extract different things and leave only the white part of the flour.
Okay.
Uh,
Okay.
and we could talk about a lot of things, but it's really why we're seeing so much gluten intolerance in
Yes,
the
I
diet.
want to talk about that for sure.
Because really the only truly gluten intolerant people are if they have celiac disease.
Right.
Everybody else, they have sensitivity to gluten primarily because we have a gluten overload in our diets. We
Mm,
have everything is made with flour. 70% of everything you find in the grocery store, processed foods, are made with wheat flour.
mhm.
And you just have an abundance of white,
Yep.
basically dead food that's in our
Yep.
diets. Our bodies are finally starting to rebel a little bit.
A
Uh,
lot, I think. Yeah.
People get that what they call the gluten intolerance, or their guts react when they eat types of foods with gluten in them. But back to the history of milling,
Mhm.
I mean, flour was a staple. Now we have a tendency to always think of wheat. But anciently, particularly in America, corn was more of a staple, and they would grind their
Hmm.
cornbread, Johnny cakes, those kinds of things were very
Hmm.
common because corn had a much higher yield than wheat, and so they grew corn because they could get a bigger yield from their crops.
Hmm.
But then with modern farming techniques, wheat gradually overtook it, and now most people think of wheat bread as bread. and it's by far the most prevalent milled grain. In fact, when we started doing wheat grinders back in 1974, they were grain mills, but everyone called them wheat grinders.
Oh,
And to
really?
this day, people still call them wheat grinders. Hey, I
Huh.
need to sell a wheat grinder. Can I get a wheat grinder?
Huh.
Because that's what 95% of people mill. It's changing a little bit now because of the advent of the ancient grains like spelt and kamut and quinoa, and people are using those much more now.
Yes.
But back to the old grist mills, like where you lived, that's where cities, towns grew up around someplace with a river that they could build a mill because people needed to do that. And if they lived remotely, they had to do it themselves by hand. Some of them built crude stone structures that they could turn them by hand. There's still a few of those on the
Hmm.
market.
Oh, wow.
Two stones, and you put a little wooden peg in, a hole in the top, and you spin it around. It's
Wow.
really
You'd
time
really build
consuming.
up those arm muscles.
Yeah, you do. I remember when I was a kid, we had my mom fed us lots of whole grains and cracked wheat cereal for breakfast, but we had to crack our own. She had a little hand mill, and me and my four brothers would take turns grinding enough for bread or for cereal or things like that.
Wow. Huh.
But
Wow.
I've been to Israel a few times, and one of my fascinations in Israel was in traveling around the different communities and the ancient excavations, you will always find a grain mill as part of those excavations.
Yeah.
And some of them were very rudimentary, and some of them were pulled by animals, some of them turned by hand.
Hmm.
I took probably 50 pictures of grain mills all around these excavated sites. It was
Hmm.
fascinating to me being in
Wow.
the business.
Absolutely.
But
And
most people ate coarse breads.
huh.
They,
Right.
they call black bread in Russia. They still call it black bread because it's rye. But most people ate very coarse breads, and they were much healthier for it.
Yes. And it was all they knew, right? The
So,
average country person never had anything like Wonder Bread.
no, well, Wonder Bread.
We shouldn't
You
call
can
it
take a
bread,
loaf
right?
of Wonder Bread. You can take a whole loaf and basically compact it down to the size of a baseball.
Hmm. Yeah.
It's just,
Yeah.
it's not very good for you. But it was enriched 11 different ways or something, and
Right. Right.
uh,
So there's so many things I want to ask you, but let's start with that, with the enriched thing. When I believe it was it around World War I or two?
World War One, and then really came into prevalence in World War Two.
Okay. So is that why we were concerned about the enriched flour because of the soldiers? I don't know the history.
Yeah, the soldiers, they needed nutrition, and they were eating empty calories. You get protein, some amounts of protein, but gluten is protein. Okay, so when we talk about gluten, and people say, "Oh, gluten's such a bad word," well, that endosperm is where the protein is found in the wheat. But all of those other 26 vitamins and minerals in every single kernel of wheat, doesn't matter what the variety is, they all have a little bit difference of makeup. But with 26 vitamins and minerals in a kernel of wheat, and you strip all of those out to get white flour
Mhm.
in modern technology.
Right.
Before, they just
And they
used to
do
do
that for those who don't know who are listening, tell us why. Why do they strip that out? Because they have to get the oil out, right?
Yeah, they for particularly to store it or transport it long distances, you need to get that wheat germ oil out of there. So
Right.
basically, they're removing the bran and the wheat germ. And
Yes. So, like the
anciently,
miller here at this mill,
yeah,
he just ground it up and left it all together. Everything. So
sure,
when the farmer took home their flour, it was the fresh flour that had the whole wheat berry, and they were getting all of those vitamins and minerals, right?
exactly.
Okay.
And that was primarily what people ate. And people milled fresh, because the oils go rancid very quickly. You've got about 4 days before those oils start breaking down, the oxidation starts appearing.
Hmm.
And you have the whole history of flour is basically about texture, taste, and transport. shelf life.
Mhm.
So,
It all comes down to
everybody,
money, right?
yeah, towns were built up around the water, and part of the water was the mill. And so everybody could take their grains, mill them, take them home, or a lot of people would take larger quantities during, harvest season, and then they would weigh how much grain they took to the miller, and then they could go and get that back in flour
Oh.
at certain times.
I didn't know that. I've talked to my uncle about what my grandparents did back in the 1930s to get their flour, and he didn't I guess they didn't have to do what you just said, but I love that. They could take a lot of wheat and the
Sure.
miller would keep track of it and they could come back for their flour when they needed it. That makes sense.
Exactly.
Okay.
And because, you're probably well aware that wheat has an incredible storage capability. Wheat
Absolutely.
can last 50, 60, 100 years. They found wheat in the ancient tombs of Egypt and some of the king's
Yes.
tombs. They were able to grow it, plant it, sprout it.
So,
Uh,
I have a question for you about that, Gary.
okay.
Why do we always say, "Oh, it can last 20 or 30 years?" Why don't we say wheat berries last thousands of years? Because they do,
They
right?
do government regulations.
Oh,
And
okay.
you also have to be aware that if people store it improperly and you tell them, oh, it'll last you 100 years, and
True.
then open it up and the weevils
That's a
have
good
eaten it
point.
all, they're like,
That's a
well,
good point.
you lied to me.
Yeah, good
Because
point, good point.
the weevil eggs kind of live in the wheat, and it's almost impossible to get rid of them. So you have to have airtight seal or a vacuum seal or store it really tight. There's all kinds of methods
Yeah.
for storing wheat to preserve it. Diatomaceous earth, some people sprinkle that through it
Hmm,
because weevil can't live in diatomaceous earth, but it's safe for humans.
okay.
There's a dry ice method. There's the little oxygen packets. But back to milling,
Yeah,
uh, as people move further and further and further away from a milling source, they had to find ways to transport it. The earliest white flour was nothing more than sifted flour.
oh,
And
they just took the bran out.
they just took the bran, and you can sift literally the wheat germ and the bran out.
Mhm,
And you hear of, well, when they used to put it in burlap bags or cotton bags,
mhm.
1x flour, 2x flour, 3x flour, and
What
you
did that
also
mean?
how many times it's been sifted.
Oh, okay.
And, uh,
So those old recipes in the cookbooks from 1920 and they tell you sift this 3 times, it's because it's the older flour.
it's older flour,
Okay.
yeah. And you had the people start getting a taste for um, lighter, fluffier bread goods. Back in ancient times, and even in the 1700s, only the aristocracy, only the kings and the queens and the courts could have those real delicate, light, fluffy goods because they had people that they could order to sift it and
Right.
their flour uh, as fine as possible. Now we have modern extraction methods. Really, white flour came into being with the advent of the steel roller mills.
Okay.
Steel roller mills allowed them to separate those things much easier than just sifting everything. And then bleaching came in. People
Mhm.
really wanted snow white goods. And we still
Crazy.
allow bleaching in the United States. It's outlawed in the UK, it's outlawed in most parts of the world because they know it's carcinogenic.
Yeah. It
But
makes no sense whatsoever, and who
but our
needs the white
wonderful
flour?
FDA still says that it's safe for you. So
It's I'm
if you
glad
want
they're
to,
watching out for us, aren't you?
well, I'll tell you, I just every time I pay my taxes, I feel so good because they spend my money so wisely. And as
I
long
don't
as
I don't sense any sarcasm.
not at all. As long as they spend it wisely, I'm happy to
Oh,
participate.
oh my goodness. Okay, so they figured out with the steel roller how to get out the parts that were making the flour coarser, and they have this nice flour now, this 3 times sifted even, but then they realized it also could sit on the shelf a really long time, right?
Right. And you could transport it, when I live here in Utah, and one of the early Utah leaders of the LDS faith was
Mhm.
Brigham Young. And they
Mhm.
had to transport all the way from Nauvoo, Illinois, all the way to Salt Lake. They carried flour with them.
Mhm.
Well, it wasn't very healthy for them. And because
Yeah.
they sifted it so that they could transport it and, in barrels and bags, was a good way to store it. You could keep the bugs out, but not really easily. Uh,
Right.
so
Okay, so
well,
then
there's
the
just so
government
much to talk about. Anyway, go ahead.
I know, I know. So the government got involved when they realized the soldiers needed more nutrition and this flour had been stripped of everything, right?
Well,
So
when you make white flour in today's methods, where you're literally stripping everything and not just with sifting, but chemical extraction now
right.
is huge in flour production.
Mhm.
You are removing literally all 26 vitamins and minerals.
Yeah.
And then the government finally stepped in. I mean, truthfully, that won't support a rat.
Yeah.
Um, you just don't have any of the things that make a whole food. When you take a whole food like that and you say, well, I'm going to take, and literally they take over 90% of the nutrition out of it and leave just the white gluten protein,
Mhm.
it won't support life. But the
Yeah.
way wheat is now, if you mill fresh flour, you have 26 vitamins and minerals, tons of amino acids, and just wheat flour alone gives you every amino acid except two to give you a complete protein. It will sustain life indefinitely.
Wow. Wow.
If we
Now,
talk
what the
about
number I've always heard quoted is 40 out of the 44 essential nutrients. So I'm
that's
guessing two of those are those amino acids you just mentioned.
that's
Do you
correct.
know what the other two things are that aren't in there? I
Oh,
don't know. I
there's
have no idea.
there's I don't
Okay,
know
that's fine. But
right then,
40 out of the 44 are there. That's what's important in
that's
this wheat
correct.
berry. Just
Yeah.
in the wheat berry.
And then
It's
if you add
crazy.
any dairy product or any bean legume product to wheat, you form a complete protein because
Okay,
both of those
yes.
have the two amino acids that you're lacking in wheat.
Okay. So, real food is beautiful, isn't it?
Oh,
Amazing.
it's amazing.
Amazing.
You can stay healthy and live long, and you don't have to, you know, our grandparents, great grandparents, and particularly one generation before that, there were no stores. You couldn't go buy Twinkies and cupcakes and crackers
Absolutely.
and cookies. And today, 99% of those are made with white processed flour because
Right.
it's the cheapest additive to make it taste good and look good and be palatable.
Yeah.
There was a great study that was done in the 1970s, and I'll just mention it briefly, but it was a study based on whole grain consumption and sugar consumption. Okay. And
Mhm.
from 1700s to the late 1800s, whole grain consumption was about 200 pounds per person per year, 240 something pounds per person per year.
Okay.
Sugar consumption was less than, I think, 10 pounds per person per year.
Hmm.
Okay, so we were eating pretty healthy. People were still dying, but they were dying of the things that we don't die of anymore, diseases and viruses and
Right.
all of these things that we couldn't control until we got polio vaccines and all these other things,
And
measles,
cleaned up our water supply.
clean up our water
Yeah.
supplies. Now that number has just reversed. Now
Hmm.
we eat less than 40 pounds of whole grains per person per year.
Wow.
And this was, I'm talking back in the 70s. And now we eat almost 200 pounds of sugar per person.
Wow.
So what
Now,
do we,
before you go any further, I
yeah,
don't know if you know, I am a sugar maker. So I do love sugar, but
hey,
that's an insane
I'm
amount.
a sugar addict. Okay. I am. I just absolutely, I
But at
love
least the
sweet
natural
things.
stuff has the polyphenols and the nutrients in it. But you're not
Exactly.
talking about the natural sugar. That's not what the average person is eating.
No, they're eating processed white refined
Yeah,
sugar. And
absolutely.
because it's in everything you buy in the grocery store.
Yep, the refined flour and the refined sugar is
So what do you
everywhere.
think happened to how we're dying these days?
Yeah.
We don't die of all the things that we have vaccines for and all the medicines we have, but we're dying of heart disease, obesity, all of these things that lead to
Yeah,
bad diet. That's where our death is coming from.
yeah.
Um, they didn't used to die of those things. They were
Now those
healthy.
numbers that you gave me were the '70s? That wasn't even recent?
I think that was, I first taught a class on that in 1979. So I know the study was someplace in the 70s.
Wow.
And it
And
was,
I can't imagine. I need to look up if there's a more recent study because I can't imagine the numbers today.
yeah, it's,
Wow.
although we're seeing a little bit of renaissance of people milling flour, getting back to the earth, getting back to natural things. We do a
Absolutely.
lot of commerce with the homesteaders
Yep.
that, and the homesteading movement is massive in this country right now.
Absolutely. We moved to our own little homestead 10 years ago ourselves. I
Isn't
know.
that wonderful?
It is. It is. We raise
An
our own pork
amazing
and we have
lifestyle.
chickens and ducks and grow our own food in our 3 gardens. It is. It's amazing. But the crazy thing is you can live in the middle of New York City and have access to fresh flour in a heartbeat. So easy.
Absolutely.
It's
Absolutely.
amazing. And I want to get into that, but before we do, I still want to finish off this idea of the history that we were talking about. So, the they took out all the good stuff and they had this refined white flour. They even bleached it, but they realized, well, we can enrich it, right? So tell us why what happened with the
Well,
enrichment?
they started enriching it, voluntary enrichment, in the 1940, maybe 41.
Mhm.
And then at the end of the war, they dropped the voluntary program, but then they brought it back as mandatory. I don't remember the year, Michelle,
Okay. Yep.
but they realized that it literally would not sustain human life. So they brought back, and now the government, if you have white flour, it's mandatory. I think that's 11 nutrients have to be enriched. So they
Hmm.
put uh, synthetic vitamins and minerals back
Yes.
through the
I'm
enriched.
glad you said that S word. It's totally synthetic. They're not natural
Not at all.
and they're not occurring in the wheat berry with the other minerals that would naturally being in the wheat berry that help our body consume all of them. When you're just
Yes,
getting synthetic ones and you're just putting some of them, our body can't even process most of what they're putting back in there.
not at all.
Yeah.
Now, one other thing, and I'll just mention it really briefly, is so lots of things happen. You take the bran out of a whole food like wheat, and now you have something that's not moving it through your body well enough. You've taken the
Yes.
fiber out. So now
Mhm.
you can find fiber breads, and they're using the cheapest flour sometimes they can get, but it's high fiber. And people are saying,
Mhm.
well, fiber is good for me. I'm going to eat high fiber bread. I've heard somebody who has questioned recently whether that's still allowed in the US. I just did some research. They still allow in the US a fiber additive of human hair and duck feathers
Wow.
in commercial bread in the US. And they buy the
Wow.
human hair primarily coming from places like Asia by the container loads, and then it's ground, refined, purified, bleached, and then the FDA allows it as a fiber additive. And the same with duck
Wow.
feathers; they grind it. And so, if you have a high fiber bread, chances are it could be an FDA approved kind of fiber that you
Oh my
can't get
word. You
in
said
the
duck
store.
feathers as well? Duck
Duck
feathers?
feathers, yeah,
Gary,
because
we
it's so
own
cold.
ducks. Ducks are dirty. I can't imagine who's regulating
They
these feathers
sanitize
and
these. The government says, hey, as long as you process it, wash it, grind it fine, bleach it out, make sure it's
oh,
clean.
oh my word. So you're
But the
paying big money for this high fiber bread that you think is fancy. It has enriched flour that is no good for you and has no essential nutrients and you get to eat duck feathers and human hair.
Yeah,
Wow.
but if you want brown bread in the store, then just read the ingredients, and they color it with molasses,
Right.
turn it brown.
Yep.
There are some good breads out there. Don't get me wrong. There's some really good artisan bread bakeries and some people making some really good bread.
Yes. Yes.
Uh, I I stumbled across Dave's Killer Bread. I used to make. I estimated that I've made well over 10 or 15,000 loaves of bread in life, but now I live alone and I don't bake. Sometimes I do here at the office because we have a test kitchen upstairs.
Nice,
But I
nice.
found a Dave's Killer Bread at the store that I really like, and it's really great ingredients.
Now, he's not using fresh flour, though. I'm acting like Dave's actually the one baking it, but
No, actually, he's using fresh milled flour.
is he really?
Mhm.
Okay, so there are some products out there that you can
There's a
find
few,
that are
yeah,
genuine.
but
Okay.
you buy a loaf of some breads, and you have about a 5 day. They'll give you a pull date of 5 to 7 days.
Mhm.
Um,
Right.
anyway, I keep digressing, and I apologize for that. But
No, it's all fascinating.
here's the amazing thing: we take the most natural fiber out of wheat by removing the bran and the wheat germ, and then replace it with artificial fiber when all we had to do was mill the grain, make the bread, and we
Yeah.
get all of the benefits.
We have to pause this episode though, because I need to ask you a question. Did you know there is a way to grow amazing fresh food with no worries of weeds, pests, or any concern about poor weather conditions? In fact, you can grow food year round, literally in your kitchen, no matter where you live. I'm talking about sprouts. They are nutrient dense food packed with vitamins and minerals, fiber, protein, and antioxidants. And I love that there are all different types of seeds you can sprout. So you get varying nutrient profiles with all the different seeds that you sprout. I've put together a really helpful resource for you. Go to solelyrested.com/sprout, SPROUT. And there I'm going to explain maximum benefits, give you lots of insights into how you can sprout well, give you tips and tricks to avoid any problems, tell you what sprouts to use and how to use them. All of it, solelyrested.com/sprout to get that resource. And there I will introduce you to True Leaf Market. I mean, I've been telling you about True Leaf Market for, years and years because I love this company. They've offered you a really sweet discount available for a very limited time. Go check it all out at solelyrested.com/sprout. Also, guys, I want to talk about botanicals for a really quick second. A botanical is simply a plant or a part of a plant that's valued for its medicinal or therapeutic properties. I love to forage for wildflowers and botanicals that have these great properties, but first of all, I don't always have the time. In fact, I usually don't have the time, or the things that I'm looking for aren't growing in the wild near me. So I was elated when my favorite tea company started a line of botanicals, and they are always adding to it. Go check out my current favorite ones that I highly recommend and enjoy the discount code as well. Go to solelyrested.com/botanicals. Don't miss it. There's great things there and new ones all the time. You're going to love it. Solelyrested.com/botanicals. Yeah, but it all comes back to, well, two things. Money, there's more money to be made if they can make their flour and they can strip it of all the oils and they can leave it on a store shelf for 2 years. There's much more money to be made, right?
Much more
And
money.
then and then two, consumerism. A lot of the fault, we have to put some of the blame on us as the consumer, that we are making these choices and we want the convenience of the flour that can sit in our pantry for 2 years.
That's right.
But if we could educate ourselves and listen to people explaining to us that fiber can come from human hair and duck feathers, I think it's enough to motivate us and our love for our family that we really want to make an extra step. If it's an extra step or two, and I'm able to give my family 40 of the 44 essential nutrients in the cookies that I'm baking today, why would I not want to take that extra step or two? It's just a matter of becoming educated and learning how to do it.
That's exactly right.
Hmm.
And it's actually simpler if you have. I'll give a shameless plug for wheat grinders and bread makers.
Oh, yeah.
Um, if you have a wheat grinder sitting on your counter and you have a 5-gallon bucket of wheat that's stored well with an airtight lid, and you decide, and you have your other ingredients, and you say, well, I'm going to make some bread for dinner tonight. You only need about an hour and 10 minutes to have hot bread coming out of the oven. By the time you mill some grain for 6 minutes, mix it 8 to 10 minutes, let it rise for 30 minutes, and bake for 25 to 30 minutes. It doesn't take time. It's just a mindset.
Yeah. And
Now,
the kneading, you have to allow time to knead it, especially with the fresh flour, I find.
well, that's why not with a Bosch or a Nutrimill mixer. It's an 8 minute
Yes.
process. It's literally an 8 minute process to knead it.
I I have used different mixers trying to make bread, and I've never experienced one like the Bosch. The Bosch, if I'm making bread, I won't do it without the Bosch because it's unbelievable. But you do have to allow, like you said, the 7 or 8 minutes that it will take, but it's hands off. You walk away and you come back and your
Put it
bread
in your
is,
bread pans, let it rise, and bake it.
yeah, yeah.
It's and that's why Bosch actually became famous. It was designed in 1952 as a bread maker
Hmm.
and
Okay.
for German households.
Okay. Um,
I
and
wanted to say one more. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I actually own quite a few Nutrimill grain mills, and
Oh,
I I have more than one bucket of wheat berries. I don't even know. I think it might be about a dozen that I have
wow.
down. Now I do have a root cellar in this old house, and I keep them all in the buckets with the sealed lids. But I like to experiment. I like to use different soft, different hard. I sometimes combine soft and hard in my cookies even, and I love to use the alternative grains and try different things. So
Okay.
Nutrimill has made that possible for me. So I have to just personally say thank you because I'm pretty addicted.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate your support, and I've been in this business a long time, and it's a passion for me. I was going to say one other thing about grandparents and great
Yeah.
parents. My parents, just my parents, one generation away, both born in 1926, a typical meal in both of their homes growing up was bread and milk and either onions or if they could add some cheese to it. But they would literally take these hearty breads because my grandmother in particular made bread every single day. She had a family of
Mhm.
10 kids. Um, and they would just put bread and milk and onions and bread, milk, and onions and
Mm,
cheese, bread and milk and whatever they had, because the bread and milk kept everyone going. They were working
yeah,
hard. They're working out on farms and they're working and laboring, but they got complete nutrition and complete protein from just bread and milk.
it's amazing. They didn't need to add the lagoons that you mentioned?
Well, either dairy or
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 lagoons.
legumes are the two
Oh,
amino acids that wheat lacks.
I'm glad I clarified that because I thought you had to have both to get them all.
No, you can use
That's
one or
amazing.
the other.
That's awesome.
You know, you
Well, we have more in common than I knew because both of my parents actually were from families of 10 children. They were both one of 10, and they both would talk often how their mothers made bread daily. It was just a fact, multiple loaves of bread daily because
well,
they ate a lot of bread. Yeah.
they had to.
Yeah.
I remember when I first gave my grandmother a Bosch mixer.
Hmm.
Um, she had been making bread forever, her
Mm-hmm.
whole life. They were poor. My father was raised in a tent
Mm.
and during the Great Depression. So said, "Well, Grandma, give me your recipe." She says, "Well, I don't know what my recipe is. I just know what I'm
Mm.
throwing in." So we started throwing it in the Bosch. We ended up with 18 pounds of dough in the Bosch, and it was trying to climb out of the
Wow.
bowl and then would pull back down with that dough hook and up and
Yep.
down. And we finished that kneading process in about 11 minutes. And she
Wow.
finished it and she said, "Oh, this is such good dough." She said, she started crying. Oh, if I would have had this machine when I
I
had 10
love
kids at home,
it.
she
Oh,
was
wow.
amazed because that used to
Wow.
take her hours and hours and hours of her day.
Absolutely, and I can't imagine how strong these women's hands and
Oh,
forearms were. I can't even imagine. Okay, so did she pull the flour out and do the window pane and just ooh and ah over? Because I do that often with my Bosch. I look at the window pane and the
yeah.
dough and I think how good it feels.
Yeah, she just grabbed it, was playing with it, and she says, "Oh, this is wonderful." She was
Yeah.
amazed. So she used it until she died, and
Oh, that's so
she didn't
cool.
have to,
Now
you know
18 pounds is excessive, right? Don't you recommend is it 12 that you say? How
yeah,
far?
12 is
Okay.
about a full load in there, but it handled 18 fine.
Wow. That's crazy. So, just random questions I'm gonna throw at you now because I'm wondering, flour sacks. I find that fascinating because I actually own a blanket my grandmother made me when I was born, made out of flour sack fabric, and I find it fascinating. So tell us about how that worked.
Well, they had to transport flour, whether they had to transport it back to their farm, which could have been a 1 hour ride in the wagon, or it could have been a half a day ride. But they had to
Right.
transport it from the mill back to the farm or back to where they lived. So some people had barrels, and if they had large quantities, they generally used barrels. And Cooper's barrels back then were just airtight.
I was just gonna ask you because I have some of my grandfather's old barrels that are not airtight. I think he transported nails in them, so they have
Yeah,
openings,
they
but
had
there was a
different
certain kind.
grades, but food
So they were like
ones,
tongue and groove, the way they fit
well,
together?
the slats would come together, but then they would pound these iron rings around the barrels,
Right.
and that would
Okay.
just tighten and tighten and tighten them. And then to
Okay.
get them even more tight, they would fill them with water for a while, set them aside, and then when they emptied the water, they would shrink together even more.
Never knew that. Okay. That's
And
great.
the flour sacks were really fine woven cotton and very durable. In fact, most people would haul their flour in them, and after they've used them for a while, because gunny sacks is what they called them.
Hmm.
And these gunny sacks then became kitchen towels and dry the kids off after you bring them out of the
Right.
tub. And
So they actually reuse the bags. I actually didn't know that. I thought they would just go ahead and make a dress then after they got the bag home, but they'd use it again and again and then make something out of it.
sure, yeah,
Okay.
they were really
Now, my
good.
uncle says at their mill, they had a choice. They could, I can't remember what he told me the choice was, but the fabric sack was one choice. So I'm guessing maybe you even paid a difference depending on how you took your flour home.
Yeah, I
I don't
don't
know.
know that answer. I do know
Okay.
that people would haul it however they could, but
Yeah.
if they lived close enough to a mill, they were only getting enough flour to use for a few days, and then they'd, you know, go back and forth. Um,
Okay. Did they like it? Did some people press that and take it out further? I mean, it wouldn't go bad probably for maybe a month, right? It wouldn't have the nutrients, but
well, no,
would
the
it?
nutrients pretty much stay. You oxidize, the oils start going a little bit rancid, but doesn't hurt it. It's just taste and smell. But
Oh,
they would they would take rancid flour and make bread if they're hungry. And
okay.
then as they started traveling further and further distances, that's when white flour became prevalent, and they were sifting the flour, and they were trying to get as much of the oil or the bran
Right.
and the wheat germ out as possible, because then they could transport it a long ways and transport it sometimes for months, months and
Yeah.
months.
Yeah, for sure. So then, okay, before we wrap up, pull it back to the gluten topic because you had said at one point that essentially what we're left with when they take all the good stuff out, except for the ridiculous synthetic nutrients they add back in, we're left with gluten, right?
That's it. Mhm. Yeah,
So,
the endosperm is what they're keeping in the white flour. And the endosperm has some nutritional value, but not much, and it's primarily only protein. And then you start adding stuff back into it. We printed a graphic one time for a handout for a seminar, and it showed a loaf of bread with needles sticking in it for all of the 11 or 14 um, enriched,
mhm,
vitamins and minerals I put back in. The government requires, I think, uh, I can't, my brain's not telling me now, but
yep,
there's specific things that bread has to have back in it now before you can sell it commercially.
okay.
And so you throw your fiber in there, you throw your um,
Duck feathers.
synthetic chemicals back in there, and then you bake it. And these big commercial bakeries, they're spitting out, you know, tens of thousands of loaves a day,
Yeah,
and then transporting them, by truck, sometimes. 6, 8 hours putting them on a grocery shelf, and they have a pull date of about 10 days after that. Whereas you make a loaf of fresh bread. uh, I won't get into politics here, but we're possibly getting a new food czar,
Right.
and who's very against preservatives and additives in food.
Hmm.
You know that preservatives are outlawed in Germany. You cannot buy bread that's been preserved. You can't buy beer with preservatives in it
Hmm.
like you can here in the US. And so the Germans, because I do a lot of business in Bosch, with Bosch in Germany,
Right. Okay.
and they buy their bread every day. They
Hmm.
go to a bakery that's baking fresh, non preservative, whole grain breads. They take it home,
Hmm.
they eat it, and then they go and get some the next day.
Hmm.
And what's left over uh, on day 2 or 3, they feed to the ducks.
Hmm.
They feed it to the
I
animals.
thought you were going to say they make breadcrumbs because that's what I do.
And they make breadcrumbs and they do all
Yeah.
kinds of things,
Yeah.
but they don't, they're only eating fresh whole grain bread.
Yeah.
And I came back from Germany one time and I thought, why can't we just buy good bread here? Now, some really good artisan bakeries are cropping up
Yeah.
and they're milling flour and they're making pretty good loaves of bread. But, I went down to, and uh, I guess I can say the name of it, but there's a company called Great Harvest, and they
Hmm.
have some pretty good bread, and they're milling some good things. But I went
Hmm.
down there because I just wanted some good hearty bread to take to a dinner party I was invited to, and I didn't have time to make any. The loaf cost me $8.
Hmm.
Okay, I could have
Yeah.
made that same loaf for about $1.70,
Yeah.
and we wonder why people are struggling to feed their families.
Yeah.
Well, with the right, like you're doing, living out and providing your own food and milling your own grains and doing your own things, you could feed a family of 10
Yeah.
because it's affordable. But so what are they doing if their food budget is limited and they have kids and they're not making ends meet? They go down and they buy a loaf of Wonder Bread or
Of
something
course.
somewhere on sale for 99 cents.
Right.
And they're literally starving their children from the inside out.
Yes. And of course, they're paying in the long run in so many ways, but literally paying for medical bills down the road too if you're not getting the nutrients that you need.
Exactly.
Um, I know with the grain mill, which Nutrimill sells so many wonderful ones, I know that a big pain point or resistance to entry to fresh flour for people is the fact that they have to buy a grain mill. But I break down, actually, I'll put an article in the show notes that I break down how quickly I recovered the cost of a grain mill
Sure.
because I wasn't buying what I had used to buy was the organic King Arthur because I wanted to at least avoid those chemicals you were talking about that they use typically to refine flour.
Yeah.
But if you're buying anything organic, you're going to make back the price in no time of this mill. But on top of that, that organic flour that I was paying too much for, honestly, it didn't have any real nutrients. It still had those synthetic nutrients that we've been talking about.
Right.
So, yes, there is a cost to start fresh flour, but how quickly it pays for itself is kind of mind boggling, if you ask me.
Yeah. I first got into this business basically as a home demonstrator. This business started as like an Avon type of
Mm.
business.
Okay. Now
We,
you mention Avon. I grew up, my mom worked for Avon from her whole life, from the time she was 18 till she retired. Go ahead. So not too bad about Avon.
it was a great system. We used to go into
Yeah.
homes and demonstrate a mill and a mixer
Hmm.
and make them fresh bread and fresh pizza and a fresh smoothie drink from the
How
farm.
cool is that? So that's where you made some of those loaves of bread you're counting. You went into people's
Yeah,
homes and made some bread.
yeah. We had teams of people all over the US and
I
Canada
didn't
doing
know
that.
that. So fun. Man, can you sign me up? I want to have one of those home parties.
They were fun. They were fun, and
Uh,
uh, there was a time, and without exaggeration, there was a time when if somebody saw a home demonstration within a year, we had a 100% close rate.
wow.
Within a year, if they saw a home demonstration, they bought a mill and a mixer.
Everybody who had came to the demo.
Everyone who came to the demo.
Wow.
That went on for almost 2 years. And
Wow. Now
so
this is back when you had bigger mills, right? They were the big, harder to
we
use
started with the
ones.
big stone mill, the great
Uh-huh.
big, what was called the magic mill back then. It was number one selling stone mill in America. And
Hmm.
then we developed high speed milling. And high
Okay.
speed milling has far overtaken the market. That would be the classic mill you have.
Yes. And
And
the impact.
the impact. The impact's new. The classic
Yeah.
we've had since 2000,
Mhm.
and
Okay.
it's the number one selling mill in the world. The impact, I think, is going to probably take about half of that market. Smaller quantities, and we still
Yeah.
sell the classics to people who want big volumes of flour.
Right.
But the classic and the impact are by far market leaders. The
And I
harvest,
almost cried, Gary, when I heard about the impact because I'm not kidding. I That's what the one thing that my followers will tell me is, "Well, I really, really want a grain mill, but I can't afford it. I'm saving up for a grain mill." And when I saw that you guys came out with a mill that was literally so affordable, at first I after I almost cried, I thought, "Well, I wonder if it will work as well." But I kid you not, it's exactly the same as the classic. I get the exact same results, just a smaller hopper, a smaller amount.
smaller amounts.
Yeah,
And that was what we set out to do. We said, because the interest in grain mills is, I can't even tell you the growth since COVID,
I'm sure.
400%,
Yep.
400%.
Wow,
But
that's
we knew we
awesome.
had to have a more affordable high speed option because we've been doing high speed milling since 1980.
Hmm.
And
Well, I know whenever you have a sale, I tell my followers, quick, you've got to take advantage of this if you have been waiting for grain mill because they sell out. You sell out all the time.
we're out of harvest mills right now. We
Are you?
just got classic mills in.
Wow. And for those of my listeners who don't follow all the mills, the harvest mill is the on demand mill. It's that really pretty bamboo wood one. And I love on demand milling because I'll just put my 4 cup measuring cup right underneath. Like you have to kind of slant it a little, get it under there. And I can see how much flour is coming out. I can toss more wheat in until I get the amount that I want. I personally love the on demand, and I don't think there's anything more convenient if you want nutrient rich flour. I mean, it's right there. You throw in the
It's
wheat berries and
It's our fastest growing mill. By
mhm.
far, the classic and the impact are the volume mills, but our fastest growing mill
Yeah.
is the bamboo harvest mill.
Okay.
And, um, you can offer all of your followers a coupon at or during or after
Yep.
this
Yep.
podcast, and you can give them your coupon good for
Absolutely.
discount off any of those products.
Absolutely. It's code solely rested, SOULY rested. And you can save for sure.
Yeah. So this is just a fascinating business. I've been blessed to be in this business now since 1979. Um, I'm a real believer in real food, real nutrition,
Mhm.
and um, keeping families healthy affordably.
Yes.
Now, there's just so much we could talk about. I always have in my storage over 1,000 pounds of grains
Wow.
because I don't ever want to be caught without grains if something happens.
Yep.
And there's all kinds of other things you can store. But if you want to really take care of your family long term and without worrying, then you're going to store wheat, some beans, uh, some powdered milk, honey or natural sugars,
Maple sugar. Yep.
and uh, make sure
Yeah.
that you keep a good sourdough starter on hand so you never run out of yeast.
Absolutely. And in 2020, man, the yeast and the flour, no flour on the shelves, crazy.
Yeah,
And I was so thankful that I had my mill and I had my wheat berries. Absolutely. Well, Gary, this has been so fun. And I know I have 20 other questions I didn't even bring up. So maybe we'll have to talk again sometime, but this
Yeah,
has
we
been
will.
so
And I
fun.
got sidetracked, and I'm sorry, but
No, that's fine. No.
home milling. One question that you were talking to me about before was home
Yeah.
milling. Home milling really began in earnest in the late 60s.
Okay.
When Magic Mill started in 1974 with that great big wooden mill,
Yeah.
they were the number one selling grain mill in the country. But there were 26 manufacturers of stone mills in
Hmm.
the United States in 1974.
Wow.
By 1980, when the first high speed mill came out, only three were remaining
Wow. And
because
why did they all fall away?
high speed milling is faster, cleaner, cheaper, more nutritious, and it's just
Hmm.
stone mills have a place because, as you said, on demand milling is really a big thing.
Hmm.
But high speed milling, if you're doing volumes of flours and you know you're making bread, nothing
Yeah.
touches high speed milling.
Yeah. And with the classic, because of its large hopper, you can put in a whole lot of wheat berries and literally walk away, come back 8 to 10 minutes later, and your flour's there and ready for you. Yeah.
24 cups and you're ready to roll.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that's awesome. Thank you for what you are seriously doing for the nutrition and the health of the nation. I'm really not being facetious at all. I'm very serious. Thank you for what you're doing. And I love it that you love your job the same way I love my job. It gets me very excited every day to think about real food and the value that it gives us.
Well, Michelle, it's really a pleasure for me to meet you and just applaud what you're doing. Live off the land, grow what you eat, and eat healthy and eat right.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Gary.
Thank you, Michelle.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that talk with Gary as much as I did. And be sure to go to soulyrested.com/flour, FLOUR, to see those grain mills that he and I were talking about and to get that discount code and all those other free resources I mentioned. Plus, when my course is available, I'm not sure if it will be when this publishes, it will be mentioned on that page. So go to soulyrested.com/flour. You can find everything there, including the brand new, just released, possibly, in-depth masterclass that will work through the whole fresh flour process and give you the most amazing recipes. So go check it out, soulyrested.com/flour for all of that. And thanks for listening, friends. Remember, it is easy to forget how blessed we are to live this life. So enjoy the simple, everyday efforts. Be thankful. Our efforts are a whole lot easier than they were back in 1930. Even so, I know it's not easy, but it's a very good life.